Thanks for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I hope all is well in your part of the world today. I want to talk to you while we have time together, and I look forward to taking your questions. But I want to talk to you a little bit about Martin Luther King and his journey, his all too short life of only 39 years. I begin my book, and I'm going to share my screen in a little while and show you some pictures, but I begin my book by saying that on December 5th, 1955, Martin Luther King became one of the founding fathers of America. And I say that because the promises made in the Constitution were merely promises and had not been fulfilled. And some people felt like they remained lies until Martin Luther King came along. And on that day, December 5th, 1955, he was in Montgomery, Alabama, the former home of the capital of the Confederacy, a place where there had still been lynchings up until that time, 360 lynchings between Reconstruction and that time in 1955. And it was a cold, rainy night in Montgomery, and thousands of people were gathered at the biggest church in town, waiting for instructions about what they should do, considering a boycott of the buses where segregation was strictly enforced, and where just a couple of days earlier, Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat on one of those buses. And the people of Montgomery were thinking that maybe it was finally time to stand up to the system of segregation that treated them as second-class citizens. And they were thinking that maybe they could stay off of those buses and force the city to consider their demands for better treatment. But it wasn't clear how they were going to do it. And this young man, 26 years old, Martin Luther King Jr., was asked to speak to the crowd that night. He wasn't asked to become the leader of the movement. He wasn't even asked to become the official spokesman for the movement. He was just asked if he would come and give a speech to help inspire people. And his initial reaction was, I'm not so sure. Let me think about it. He wasn't looking to get involved. He was new in town. He had a new church that he was getting used to. He had a baby that was only 2 weeks old at home. And this was not something he was looking for. But when the moment arose, he felt compelled. He felt compelled by his belief in America, that this could be a better country, and by his belief in God, that God commanded us to do the work to make a better society. So he got up there that night on December 5th and said to the crowd that it might be that it was the Black people of America, the people who've been treated worst, who would help the country fulfill its potential and its promise and make true those words in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights that for so long had been empty promises. And he said that night that if we're wrong in fighting for justice, if we're wrong in demanding equality, then the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. The Constitution is wrong. The Holy Bible is wrong, and God Almighty is wrong. And it was in that moment that King really found his voice. I want to show you slides now if I can. Let's see if I can do this. Sorry if I'm failing. There we go. This is King in Montgomery at the age of 26. And I wrote this book because I wanted to remind people that his fame, his leadership, his rise to becoming this iconic figure was not inevitable. I wanted to remind people that he was a person, that he had doubts, that he wasn't sure he wanted to get involved. I wanted to write a book that restored some of his humanity. I wanted to write a book that reminded people how radical he was. I wanted to write a book that would remind people how religious he was, because in the process of the last 50, 60 years since his assassination and since his name has come to grace 1,000 streets in America, and since we've made him a national holiday and created a monument, we've unintentionally, I think, watered down his message and created a very safe version of King. We've also created a version of King that rubs away the rough edges and renders him as almost a two-dimensional figure. And I wanted to remind people that he was a human being, that he chewed his fingernails, he suffered from mental health issues. He twice attempted suicide as a young man, as a teenager, that he was hospitalized numerous times for depression, that he cheated on his wife, that he plagiarized, that he failed at times and felt frustration, but he kept going. And that's a different story than we usually get in our textbooks. So when I began this journey, it took me 6 years to write this book. Um, I felt like I had a great gift. And the great gift was that there were still hundreds of people around who knew Martin Luther King Jr. And he was born in 1929. He would be 95 today. We just celebrated his birthday. And I began immediately in my journey interviewing people who knew King. Here he is with 2 of his 4 children in the backyard of their home in Atlanta. I wanted to create a more intimate portrait with this book than we're accustomed to. So I met with people like Harry Belafonte, who knew King very well, one of his closest friends. I met with people like Jesse Jackson, Juanita Abernathy, the people who knew King well, not only the famous ones, but also, some of the people who grew up with him on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, people who went to seminary with him. I interviewed his barber in Montgomery. And I also was fortunate to find archival materials that had not been used before, that had not been seen in many cases by other scholars, by other historians, including tapes that Coretta Scott King, his wife, made while right after her husband's assassination. She went to work on a book and she recorded a number of audio tapes to try to get some of her memories down on the record. I found an unpublished autobiography that Martin Luther King's father wrote. I found thousands of pages of documents collected by the SCLC's official archivist, the SCLC being King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So there was a lot of new material to work with as I assembled the story. And I just want to share with you a few of the revelations and why they matter, why we need to see King again in a new way, and why his story still speaks to us in America and around the world. This is King's family. He's on the bottom right-hand corner at about age, I don't know, I guess he's probably about 6 or 7 in that picture. That's his father, Martin Luther King Sr., in the center standing, and his mother to the left of your frame, and his grandmother to the right. Martin Luther King Sr., he was born Mike King. And actually, MLK was born Little Mike, not Mike. He was not born Martin Luther King Jr. He was born Mike King. And Mike King, the senior Mike, grew up in Stockbridge, Georgia on a sharecropping farm. His parents had been born into slavery. And when Martin Luther King Sr. was 12 years old, finally couldn't take it anymore, did not want to see his life end up the way his parents did, stuck in servitude, only a step removed from slavery. And Mike King Sr. walked off the farm one day at the age of 12 with his only pair of shoes tied over his shoulder, made his way to Atlanta. He was able to read a little bit, unable to write, and really set about reinventing himself. Went to school, talked his way into Morehouse College, became a preacher, married into the family that ran Ebenezer Baptist Church, and really created the conditions in which it was possible to raise children who thought they might be able to fight this system of injustice, fight Jim Crow. Daddy King, as everybody called him, was a civil rights fighter in his own right. But at the time he was around in his prime years, it was difficult to fight the system. It wasn't really until after World War II that we see Black soldiers coming back and the modern civil rights movement really begin to take roots. And that's when Martin Luther King Jr. begins to see the potential. And Martin Luther King Jr. is able to not only go to Morehouse like his father, but go to seminary and then go to study in the North at Boston University, where he pursues his doctorate degree. And he begins seeing that it's possible to fight Jim Crow and to use the pulpit to do it, that the ministry had a rare opportunity because, most Black people in America feared speaking out because they might lose their jobs. And of course, they might also be the victims of violence. The Klan, as I mentioned, there were still lynchings in the South, and the Klan was very active. So the ministry gave people like Daddy King and Martin Luther King Jr. a perch from which they could speak out. So when Martin Luther King decides finally that he is going to become a preacher, he sets his eyes on returning to the South, even though he's studying in the North, because he feels like he wants to make a difference, not just leading a church, but leading a struggle. And it's very important that in Boston, while he's studying, he meets Coretta Scott King. And Coretta Scott was in Boston studying to become a concert singer at the New England Conservatory of Music. And I think the reason Martin falls in love with Coretta is that she has more experience as an activist than he does. When she goes to Antioch College as an undergraduate, she's exposed to all kinds of protest movements, and she gets involved. She protests a barber shop that won't cut Black people's hair. She protests her own school because they won't allow Black students to do student teaching in white area schools. So when they meet, and Martin Luther King was a prolific dater, he had a lot of women that he was frequently juggling. But when he meets Coretta, he says, "You're the one I want to marry." And it's clearly because she is an intellectual force and a committed activist, and they see themselves as this great partnership, this great team that can do this work that, really hasn't, there's no path for this yet. They're making it up as they go along. There is no mainstream civil rights movement yet. It's not really until they get to Montgomery that they begin to see what's happening, and they make the decision to join it. And it's very important to point out that when King agrees to speak in Montgomery and the Montgomery bus boycott begins to work, and the white establishment feels threatened, and the white media in the North begins to pay attention, King and Coretta both have to decide whether they're really committed to this. And soon after the boycott begins, their home is bombed. Someone puts dynamite on the front porch. Thank God nobody is hurt. But Martin Luther King's parents and Coretta's parents come to Montgomery and say, "That's it. You're done. We're taking you home." And it's Coretta who speaks up first and says, "We're not going anywhere. We have a responsibility to stay here and do this work." And if that hadn't happened, who knows what direction the civil rights movement goes. So I think it's important to acknowledge that every step of the way, Coretta Scott King is a partner pushing her husband. And it's Coretta who's often saying, we have to do more. We have to speak out on things beyond race, beyond civil rights. And of course, the complicating factor there is that Martin Luther King is not very progressive when it comes to women's rights. And he does not offer his wife the opportunity to be more involved in the movement as a leader, as an organizer, even though she's beseeching him for that opportunity. And it's one of the real problems that we have in telling the King stories. Not only is he unfaithful to Coretta, but he fails to really appreciate the role that women might have played in the movement, and he fails to promote women time and time again. And when Coretta even says to him directly, "I feel called by God to do this work just like you do," Dr. King's response is, "Well, you're a woman, and your job is to stay home with the children." And she accepts this while finding ways to continue to push and to push him to be more progressive. So it's a challenging part of the story. After Montgomery, it's worth remembering that King fails quite often, that he struggles. His movement tries to recapture the magic of Montgomery in other places, and time again, it doesn't go well. He goes to places like St. Augustine, Florida, and Albany, Georgia, and tries to launch community-wide protests there with marches and people getting arrested. And he really achieves very little in those places. And at the same time, we start to see other people taking the lead. We start to see students in particular seizing the momentum from Montgomery. We see lunch counter sit-ins. We see freedom rides where people are riding buses throughout the South to prove that integrated buses are now the law. And King is kind of on the margins. He's helping where he can, but he's not finding the momentum. He's not able to replicate the magic of Montgomery. And it's not until Birmingham in 1963 that he finally breaks through. And it's in Birmingham that he is able to mount a long enough and strong enough protest that the white media and the white politicians finally begin to respond and to say something must be done. King is deeply frustrated with President John F. Kennedy. He's deeply concerned that the president has made these promises to Black America, and he's dragging his feet on proposing civil rights legislation. So Birmingham is about integrating the city of Birmingham, but it's really about putting pressure on Kennedy to come through with that civil rights legislation that he's been promising. And it's worth noting that while King is negotiating with Kennedy, the Kennedy administration has authorized wiretaps on some of King's associates and on some of the offices where King does work, because they're beginning to worry that he might be under the influence of Communist Party members, former Communist Party members in some cases, and current Communist Party members in other cases. So Robert F. Kennedy authorizes the FBI to begin wiretapping the phones of some of King's closest associates and aides. And this is a huge, ethical issue. Should we be surveilling private citizens, and toward what end? In what way is King perceived as a threat by our government? It becomes very clear very quickly that King is not interested in Communist Party activities, and that he's not under the influence. As they listen to his phone calls, even the FBI concludes that there's no communist activity happening here. But at the same time, they begin to hear him on the phone with women other than Coretta, women with whom he seems to be having affairs. And that becomes the obsession of the FBI. So even as King is negotiating with Kennedy, even as he's beginning to plan for this protest that you see here in this slide, the March on Washington, King is in this very complicated relationship with our nation's leaders, where he is a partner in pushing for civil rights legislation, and he's still being treated cautiously, to say the least. You might argue that he's being treated as an enemy or a potential troublemaker. So King is navigating this, and the Kennedys warn him about his communist friends, and King refuses to cut ties with them because he believes that they are valuable allies, and he's not worried. He says the civil rights movement is the best thing for the Cold War, for America in the Cold War, to the world, that American democracy is the greatest form of government on earth, by showing that it is inclusive, by showing that it is aware of its flaws and working on them, trying to become a more just and equal society. So when King finally gathers this crowd, 200,000 people, it's a monumental event. It's the first time that white people have seen Black people on television, violent protests. They've seen the buses burning in Mississippi. They've seen the dogs attacking protesters, innocent, peaceful protesters in in Birmingham. They've seen the water cannons. They've seen Bull Connor's men dragging Black protesters to jail. And now, for the first time on August 28th, 1963, they see this beautiful scene of Black and white people on the lawn, the national lawn in Washington, under the statue of Abraham Lincoln, singing in harmony and holding hands. And it's this moment of great optimism that the country could be changing, that we might finally be ready to put our racist ways behind us and atone for the sins of slavery. And King gives this incredibly moving speech. And he doesn't just say, "I have a dream." It's worth remembering that the first half of that speech, and it's called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the first half of that speech is really about economic justice. It's about the fact that Black people have been treated badly, and it's time for America to pay for that. He talks about things like reparations. He talks about things like police brutality. It's a radical speech that he wants Americans to hear, and they hear it and they respond. And there's this moment of hope that even the white mainstream press says that this country may be turning a corner. But the next day, the FBI produces a memo saying that in light of this oratory, in light of King's power to unite the masses, we must now view him as the most dangerous man in America when it comes to race. And that's when the FBI increases its surveillance of King. Rather than seeing him as somebody who needed to be protected and who needed to be supported, they see him as a greater threat than ever now. And they install wiretaps on his home and his office phone, and they begin planting bugs in his hotel rooms. So I think it's worth pausing to consider why the FBI, and not just the FBI, but others in government, viewed him as a threat at that point, as an increasing threat. And I think the answer is that they saw him as somebody who might force change, and they were reluctant to change. They were committed, and J. Edgar Hoover in particular saw his job as protecting the status quo. And that's a problem that we wrestle with today. Even reformers, even though this country is one built in revolution, we often have a hard time dealing with revolutionaries and dealing with rebels and with radicals. We remain afraid of change, and that's an important message. That's one reason why we need to continue to tell King's story. So in the years after the March on Washington, King wins a Nobel Peace Prize. He begins to see his role as even bigger, that his job is not just to fight segregation, but to fight for economic justice, to begin speaking out on war, to begin speaking out on hunger and poverty. And he really begins to lose popularity. He begins speaking out on Northern racism increasingly. And he's been speaking out on it his whole career, but the white media really hasn't been paying much attention. Now he forces the issue. He moves to Chicago, where I'm speaking to you from today, and moves into a dilapidated apartment on the West Side and tries to call attention to the segregated housing, the segregated schools, the discrimination in hiring. And he's bashed for this. He's really beaten up by the media. And he comes away from Chicago with very little to show for it. He begins to feel tired. He's a father of 4. He's not home very much. He's constantly on the road. He's being besieged, really, from all sides. The younger Black activists feel like he's too conservative because he's part of the system. He's criticized by Malcolm X, by Stokely Carmichael for being an Uncle Tom. And at the same time, he's too radical, too liberal for many Northern white people who have been supporting his cause. When he's speaking out against segregation in Birmingham, they're happy to send money. When he starts speaking out against segregation in Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and Los Angeles, that money begins to dry up, and life becomes more and more difficult for King. And some of this media coverage that he's getting is in part due to the fact that the FBI has been sharing its surveillance. King doesn't really fully appreciate how that has an impact. The FBI is determined to try to damage his effectiveness, and it's working, because King is getting bashed more and more often by the press. His public approval ratings are dropping. By 1966, something like 2/3 of all Americans say they disapprove of Martin Luther King. It's really worth remembering that now, as we celebrate him, as I said earlier, as a national holiday, and we have 1,000. It's worth remembering that he was unpopular among much of America in those last years of his life. And it's also worth remembering that he could have retreated. He could have gone back to working on voting rights in the South. He could have even taken some time off and said, I'm going to let the younger activists take over from here and let them lead. He could have gone and become a college professor, which was his initial career ambition before he got caught up in the movement. But he didn't do any of those things because he felt a responsibility. He felt like his religion in particular called him to do this work, and that it would be an abrogation of his faith to turn aside, to step back. And in fact, he begins to say that his religious faith requires him to speak out on these other issues, on the war in Vietnam, for example, for poverty. And he begins really growing more and more outspoken and willing to risk everything for these beliefs, as even his own friends and allies are urging him to sort of cut back, to be a little bit more measured, and especially when he's speaking out on the Vietnam War, because that really damages his relationship with President Lyndon Johnson. And it's a fascinating relationship. I want to talk about it for a minute here, because I would argue that they are perhaps the most effective and important partnership between an activist and a president in our history, with the other one possible exception being Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And in the beginning of this relationship, they really have a great intimacy and a great level of comfort. We can listen to their phone calls because the Oval Office phone calls were recorded by President Johnson. And you can hear in the beginning how LBJ is calling him Martin and really trying to drill down and understand why Black protesters are upset when the rioting begins in Los Angeles after the murder of a Black motorist by a police officer. King and Johnson are on the phone talking about the real core issues about why Black people in America feel dispossessed and disenfranchised, why they don't trust the police, why they are struggling to find jobs. And Johnson seems like he's engaged. But over time, as the wiretaps take their toll and as King speaks out more aggressively on Vietnam, the relationship really frays. And one of the things I discovered in my research was that President Johnson was getting almost daily updates directly from J. Edgar Hoover about King's activities. Really small, seemingly petty things about, what he was saying, what he was writing, and who he was talking to on the phone, including the women. LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover seemed to have an almost voyeuristic interest in King's extramarital affairs. And it severely damaged their relationship, severely damaged the work that they might have continued to get done together. And of course, the war is a big part of that, because LBJ was obsessed with the Vietnam War and with the backlash to it, and he saw King now as part of the problem. But in those last years of his life, King remains committed, even if it costs him popularity, even if it costs him his relationship with the president. And he's exhausted. He's traveling the country, speaking out, feeling like no one's listening to him anymore. And one of the ironies of the FBI wiretaps is that we can now read the transcripts of all of King's conversations, including his conversations with Andrew Young, who's seen in this photo, his conversations with Bayard Rustin, with Stanley Levison, his closest aides. And over, King is saying, I feel like no one's listening to me anymore. I don't understand why everything I say is being bashed in the media. And we can also read the transcripts of conversations between people like Andrew Young and Bayard Rustin and Stan Levison, where King isn't on the phone. And we can hear them saying how worried they are, that he's really being ground down. He's exhausted. He's depressed. At one point, they talk about whether they could possibly get him some medical help, whether he would consider seeing a psychiatrist. And they know that the answer will be no, because King is worried that the FBI will find out about it and use that to further damage his reputation. It's very sad and very troubling, but it's also inspiring in a way, because King only doubles down on his beliefs, and he begins speaking out more on the Vietnam War, begins speaking out more on poverty. And on April 4th, 1967, exactly a year before his assassination, he speaks at Riverside Church in New York and gives, what may be my favorite of all his speeches, and it's called Beyond Vietnam. And what he's saying is that the war in Vietnam has consequences beyond the battlefields. It has consequences to our morality, that America needs to behave morally, that we are the greatest country on earth, but we have to set an example. And that by indulging in militarism, by succumbing to materialism, by failing to eradicate racism, these triple evils, he calls them, we are damaging our own souls. And he says that he still sees himself as a Baptist preacher, and that his job is to save souls. His activism is just an extension of his faith. And he gives this incredibly moving speech, this incredibly moving sermon, and says that he has to speak out on all of these things, or else he would not be true to his commitment to the Bible. And the next day, he gets a phone call from one of his closest friends and advisors, somebody who's been with him for more than 10 years now, somebody he calls late at night when he seeks counsel, when he's feeling low. This is Stan Levison. And Levison says to him, I didn't like that speech. It didn't sound like you. And I just think that it's going to make our work so much more difficult. It's going to make it harder for us to raise money. It's going to make it harder for us to gain allies in Congress. And this is King talking to one of his best friends. And he has to say, effectively, don't you know me? Don't you know why I do this? What I said may have been politically unwise, but it was not morally unwise. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking that the FBI is listening to this and that we know exactly what he says, but it's heartbreaking to think that this great advocate for justice, this great man of peace is so low at this point that even his closest friends don't understand him and he feels completely lost. And yet, what does he do for the next year? He begins planning what he calls the Poor People's Campaign. And he's going to take all of these beliefs that I just talked about. He's going to bring together thousands of people in Washington. They're going to occupy Washington, D.C. until the government agrees to make fundamental changes in the economy and capitalism, until it addresses the needs of the poor, until it addresses the anti-war movement, and until it addresses the fundamental issues at the heart of racism. And he's having a hard time recruiting for this. He's having a hard time getting people to show up, to commit to coming to Washington with him. And again, he feels lost. He feels like his work is becoming more and more difficult. And in the planning for this Poor People's Campaign, which is supposed to begin in April of 1968, he gets a call from one of his closest friends, Reverend James Lawson, who's one of the people I interviewed for my book. And Lawson says, we need your help in Memphis. There's a sanitation workers strike. And the sanitation workers, who are mostly Black, are suffering through horrible working conditions and low pay. Two men, Ethel Coles and Robert Andrews, were crushed to death in the back of their garbage truck because they were not allowed to ride in the cab, and the truck malfunctioned. Will you come to Memphis and help us to gain justice for these sanitation workers? And all of King's advisors say, well, of course you don't have time for that. You're trying to pull off the biggest and most audacious movement of your career, this Poor People's Campaign in Washington. You need to focus. And King says, I have to go to Memphis because these are the people I'm talking about. These are the people I'm working for. And these are God's children. We're all God's children. So he goes to Memphis. And as we know, on April 4th, 1968, he's assassinated standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. But before that, the night before, he speaks to the crowd, to the people who are gathered in support of the sanitation workers. And he says to them, like anyone else, I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its blessings, but that doesn't matter for me now. I just want to do God's will. And I would like to see all of us reach the promised land, but I may not get there with you. And that's the last speech of his life. The next day, he's standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel and he's talking to his friends down in the parking lot, and they're getting ready to go out for dinner. And one of his friends says, you know, Doc, it's getting kind of cold. You might want to go back in and get a jacket. And he says, okay, I will. And he turns. And those were his last words. Okay, I will. As he's turning to go back into his room, a bullet strikes him in the face. And he dies almost instantly. And I like to think about those last words, and I'd like to leave you with this thought. It sometimes feels like we are living in hopeless times, and that we're seeing even King's words used against him to cut back on the rights that he fought to get. We see people saying that because Dr. King said that we should be judged by the content of our character, that we don't need civil rights legislation anymore. We don't need voting rights anymore. We see the teaching of Black history under attack in our country. We see human rights being violated all over the world. And it feels sometimes like we can't do anything about it, that we're powerless to stand up to oppression. And I would just like to remind you that Dr. King was arrested 29 times. He had his house bombed 3 times. He was stabbed in the chest. He was punched in the face. His home was shot at. He received death threats. His own government was working against him. And he never lost hope. He never gave up. And he said to us that we must stay awake to change, that we must adapt to the conditions around us, and that we must never lose hope. And I think when we go back and look at his example and read his words again, and not just I Have a Dream, but read his own writing, those words still have power, and his life story still has the power to move us so that we can all continue to say, okay, I will.